It is true that, as you may already have noticed, on this channel I am tending to feature mostly obscure old British books. So in a way, this channel could be called Obscure Old British Books in the same way as my film channel is called Obscure Old British Films. But although a lot of what I'm talking about on here is going to be old and in some cases out of print or difficult to get hold of books, I should point out that I'm reading other books as well. I'm a voracious reader. I'm indeed a bookworm and highly eclectic as well. And so I've usually got 2 or 3 books going at a time. Ever since I was a child, actually, I've been very, very fond of libraries. I used to go to the public library when I was quite small, 11 or something, and just spend more or less all day there. And my mother used to get quite worried sometimes. I just used to just sit there and read anything I could get my hands on, and then take a lot of books home and read those as well. Currently I'm reading quite a lot of interesting things. I've got at the moment, just as out of interest, I've got a rather interesting book. History is one of my really big things. Basically fiction, history, biography, anything like that. Archaeology. I recently read a very interesting book called Time's Anvil by Richard Morris, which was about the history of British archaeology. So it was going back to early antiquarians in the 17th century up to the 20th century and the developments in archaeology, which were absolutely fascinating. And also history, as I say. I've got a very interesting book by Christopher Lee called 1603, which is all about the transition after the death of Elizabeth I, the transition from an English Tudor monarch to the Scottish Stuart King James I, and the takeover, in effect, the takeover of the English crown by the Scots, which is kind of rather relevant at the moment with the Scottish referendum and so on that's just happened. And then I've got a very interesting book by a man called V.S. Naipaul, who's a well-known Trinidadian Indian writer. There's another one. That's called Beyond Belief. It's very interesting. It's a few years old now, but it's his travels through various countries mostly in Asia, which were converted to Islam at various points. What it's about is the way that Islam, coming from Arabia, basically, has been a kind of religious imperialism and been imposed on other cultures which were often influenced by much more ancient religions like Buddhism and Hinduism and other religions, and about the effects of that on people living in that part of the world. And then a very, very interesting book, which I've been enjoying very much, is another history book called Vanished Kingdoms. Vanished Kingdoms, it is the right way around, by Norman Davies, The History of Half-Forgotten Europe. This is right up my street. This is fascinating because it's about all these extraordinary kingdoms and states and things that have existed during the history of Europe, which have all vanished, and some of them people very rarely remember that they existed at all. For example, there was a kingdom called Tolosa, which was the kingdom of the Visigoths. The Visigoths were one of the various barbarian tribes that invaded the late Roman Empire, and that was in the sort of Spanish-French area. And then not many people know that there was a kingdom in Scotland, a large part of Scotland, for a very long time, from the 5th to the 12th centuries, was actually a Welsh-speaking British kingdom. The Scots were actually a tribe from Ireland, a Gaelic-speaking tribe from Ireland. And this kingdom called Altclud, it's where a place called Strathclyde is today. That was another interesting one. Burgundy, at various points controlled enormous parts of Europe, large parts of France, parts of what's now Germany, parts of what's now the Netherlands and Belgium, and even into Switzerland, were under a kingdom, or actually several kingdoms, called Burgundy. It was very, very complicated, and nobody knows whether it's actually called Burgundia 5, 6 or 7 kingdoms. It's not even clear. People don't even agree about how many actual kingdoms there were and how many periods, but it went on for a very long time. Burgundy from the year about 411 to 1795. And then I've just been reading a very interesting book, chapter in this book called Litva, which is about the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, Not many people know that there was such a thing, but for a long time there was an empire which was a combination of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and that lasted from about 1250 or so to about 1800, and it was one of the largest states in Europe, and it comprised large parts of Germany and Russia, as well as Lithuania and Poland. So I've been enjoying that very much. And then the next one's going to be about Byzantium, which has always been one of my favourite subjects, which is the Eastern Roman Empire, which lasted for well over 1,000 years until its fall in 1453. So that's another one. I enjoy history very much. Biography as well, I enjoy a lot. Social history, cultural commentary. You know, I used to read a lot more heavy-duty, more sort of philosophy and that kind of thing. I don't read so much of that now, although I do occasionally. But that's the kind of area I'm interested in. But the other area, which I haven't mentioned so far, is poetry. I've always loved poetry ever since I was a kid, and I've always read lots of poetry. And at the moment, I'm going through a kind of phase of rediscovering things, not books, poems, especially long poems that I read parts of years ago, but never actually managed to read the whole of. And this year, I'm very pleased to say that I finally, after many years, I managed to read the whole of Milton's Paradise Lost, from beginning to end, all the way through. And that is something I've been trying to do since I was about 13. I was a bit precocious when I was 13, and I decided to try and read Milton's Paradise Lost, but I read parts of it at that age and a bit later, and bits of it stuck in my mind. In fact, I even learnt bits of it by heart. I was so taken with it. But I've never managed to read the whole thing, and finally this year I've managed to read the whole thing. And now Milton, for me, along with Shakespeare, Milton and Shakespeare, to me, are the two greatest poets of the English language, in the sense that they, to my mind, they elevated English poetry to its highest level. I mean, you could argue. I mean, there are lots of other poets I'm interested in, and there are other poets that some people might find more relevant today, and so on. But in terms of the actual use of the English language, I think for me, Milton and Shakespeare are the two great figures. And of course, Paradise Lost is Milton's greatest work. Of course, Paradise Lost is Milton's attempt, as he put it in his own words, to justify the ways of God to man. It's the story of the fall of mankind, and also the rebellion of Satan against God, which is the cause of the fall of mankind. Because, of course, Satan flees from heaven, and then he escapes from hell, and he goes and tempts Adam and Eve to eat the apple from the tree of knowledge and break the commandment of God. Now, one of the amazing things about Paradise Lost is the figure of Satan himself. William Blake, actually, the poet, pointed out that really Satan is the hero of Paradise Lost. He is the most powerful figure. The real hero of Paradise Lost should be Christ, in fact, because it's Christ who leads the armies of heaven to overthrow Satan. But somehow Satan takes centre stage a lot of the time. And even though he is clearly an extremely wicked and scheming and greedy and ambitious and hateful figure who caused enormous damage, there is something undeniably magnificent about him. And to a certain extent, you can't help feeling a certain kind of sympathy for him, because even in the worst situation he gets into, he never gives up. He has a kind of awful, kind of dark, brooding, sort of furious determination always to go on fighting. So some of the passages for Satan are the ones that stuck in my mind from an early age. For example, there's a wonderful description, first of all, of his descent from heaven, when he's cast down with all his rebel angels. And then there's a marvellous